Jerusalem burned, and for the first time even angels looked away. The air was thick with ash and incense, with screams that had forgotten language. Smoke rolled through the streets like a tide of penance. Bells cracked, banners melted, and the sound of iron boots echoed through the narrow stone corridors of the holy city. The world had turned red and gold and black. A Templar knight moved through it, his white mantle darkened by soot, his cross now the color of rust. His name is lost, as many were, swallowed by the same fire that devoured the city. He had not come for glory. He had come for forgiveness. But on this night, forgiveness had no breath left. The convent stood near the church of St. Anne. Its walls trembled under the roar of the siege. He forced the gate open with his shoulder, sword drawn, eyes wild with the madness of holy war. Behind him men cried, "Deus vult," but he no longer knew what that meant. He only knew the weight of steel, the smell of burning oil, the sound of his own heart breaking beneath his armor. Inside the chapel, the air shimmered like a mirage. Candles had melted down to pools of red wax that ran like veins across the altar cloth. The crucifix above the altar glowed faintly in the light of the flames, as if Christ himself were burning again. And there, standing alone in the smoke, was a nun, barefoot, still. The hood of her habit had fallen back, and strands of silver hair clung to her face. In her hands, a small crucifix carved of olive wood, half burned, half pure. The knight hesitated. His sword trembled. He had seen Saracen archers, dying children, men gutted in the name of God, but never this. She did not flee. She did not cry. She looked at him as if she already knew him. "If I die," she whispered, her voice soft but certain, "tell him I wasn't afraid." The words struck deeper than any blade. He had marched for 3 years from the fields of France to this city of stone and fire, and only now did he hear faith spoken without hatred. The sword in his hand felt heavier than his soul. He could hear the roar of men outside, shouting, killing, praying, indistinguishable in their frenzy. The nun's eyes held none of that. They were quiet, like the sea after a storm. He took a step forward. The wood beneath his boots cracked. A beam fell behind him, showering sparks. The smell of burning linen filled the chapel. For a moment the knight thought of his mother, of the small church near Bordeaux where he first took communion. He remembered the taste of bread and tears. He remembered believing that God was love, not conquest. Now he stood before a woman who believed that still. She raised the crucifix slightly, not to protect herself, but as if to bless him. The firelight made the metal Christ shimmer, silver and red. Her lips moved in prayer, but he could not hear the words. Perhaps she prayed for him, perhaps for the city, perhaps for no one at all. The knight lowered his sword, slowly, painfully, like surrender. The sound of the blade touching the stone floor was clear, sharp, final. Outside, a trumpet called. Jerusalem had fallen. But here, in this burning convent, something else rose. Mercy. He looked at her, at the crucifix, at the fire. And for the first time in years, he felt small. He fell to one knee, not as conqueror, but as penitent. He whispered, "Forgive me," though he did not know to whom he spoke. The flames moved closer, wrapping the altar in light. The nun closed her eyes and began to sing, a hymn he had heard as a child. The words blurred in the smoke, but the melody carried, fragile, defiant. The knight stayed there until the song faded, until the last bell cracked, until the city's cries became silence. And in that silence, he understood. You can win the city of God. yet lose heaven's favor. It began with a sermon in Clermont, winter of 1095, when Pope Urban's voice rose over the cold air like a trumpet calling heaven to war. "Christ commands it," he said, and thousands of men answered, not with reason but with fire in their blood. They stitched crosses on their cloaks, kissed the ground, and believed the road to salvation began with a sword. The First Crusade was born in hunger and prophecy. Peasants, knights, monks, each left their homes for a land they had never seen, chasing a rumor of holiness beyond deserts and death. They crossed the Alps, the Balkans, the walls of Constantinople. They swore oaths on relics, broke them in the dust, and wrote psalms with blood instead of ink. By the time they reached the gates of Jerusalem, 4 years had passed. Many had died nameless on the road. Others arrived hollowed out by hunger and fever, their armor clinking like bones. They looked upon the holy city from the Mount of Olives and wept, not from joy, but from disbelief. After all the killing, the praying, the dying, heaven still looked far away. The siege began on the 7th of June, 1099. Arrows darkened the sun. Engines of war groaned against the walls. Men built towers from the wreckage of churches and burned olive groves to feed the flames. Priests walked among the soldiers, offering absolution before each assault, their blessings drowned by screams. The earth itself seemed to recoil from them. And yet they believed. They believed every drop of blood brought them closer to God. They believed Jerusalem would redeem them even as it burned. The paradox of faith became their banner. Kill to be holy, conquer to be pure. Amid this storm of devotion and madness walked the knight. He was neither the loudest nor the cruelest. He was the one who prayed before every strike and trembled afterward. His brothers in arms called him the hesitant one, but in his heart he carried a memory stronger than command. The voice of a priest who once told him, "A sword cannot open heaven, only mercy can." As he stood before the city walls, hearing the chants of Deus Vult echo through the dust, he wondered if mercy had been left behind somewhere in France. The air stank of death and salt. The banners of the cross fluttered like torn wings. Children cried in the Saracen quarter while priests sang over the bodies of their own. And above it all, the golden dome of the city shimmered in the heat, untouched, indifferent. The chroniclers would later call it victory, but even then some men already felt the cost. One knight wrote, "We have won the tomb of Christ, but lost his gaze." The Templar did not write. He only carried his sword, his doubts, and a crucifix carved from his childhood church. It had been a symbol of faith once. Now it felt like a weight around his neck. He did not know that before the night ended, that crucifix would lie beside another, the one held by a nun who refused to flee, who prayed as the world burned, and that between them, in the silence of a dying city, the meaning of the crusade would change forever. He had taken his vows at dawn, when the sky over Bordeaux was still pale with mist. The chapel was small, the candles few, and the sound of the bell that morning was soft, almost reluctant. He remembered kneeling before the altar, the priest placing a sword in his hands, blessing it as if it were a relic, not an instrument of death. "You will defend the Holy Sepulchre," the priest said. "You will be God's arm upon the earth." The young knight believed him. He believed that God needed men with swords, that purity could be won by steel, that heaven rewarded obedience, not doubt. Years later in Jerusalem, the same sword was dull with dried blood. The white mantle that once gleamed under French sunlight now carried stains that no river could wash away. The knight prayed each morning, but the words no longer rose beyond his throat. God had gone quiet, as if waiting for him to stop killing in his name. The other Templars marched, shouting Deus Vult, eyes bright with conviction, mouths red with zeal. They killed as if certain of paradise. He watched them and wondered what they saw that he could not. At night he sat alone near the walls, listening to the city cry beneath them. The wounded moaned in Latin, Greek, Arabic, languages of the same despair. He took off his gloves and touched the stones. They were warm, trembling, alive with the sound of siege. He thought of Christ's tomb somewhere inside those walls, buried beneath layers of blood and prophecy. He asked himself if God could still dwell in a city turned to ash. A monk who traveled with the army once told him, "Faith is like a torch in the wind. Hold it too tightly, and it burns you." The knight had laughed then, young and untested. Now the words returned, sharp as the edge of his blade. He realized he had gripped faith so hard it had scorched him from within. He remembered his comrades, the eager boy from Normandy who carved crosses into his arrows, the German giant who wept after every battle, the priest who whispered blessings to corpses because he feared none would reach heaven on their own. They called themselves Milites Christi, soldiers of Christ, but in their eyes he saw the same hunger he saw in his enemies. Not for land, not for victory, for meaning. Each morning, before the assault, the knights would kneel in the dust and receive communion. The bread was dry, the wine sour, but their faith burned like fever. When they rose, they looked like men walking out of confession toward damnation. The knight joined them out of duty, but his mind wandered. He thought of the commandment he had broken 100 times. He thought of the faces of those he had slain, men who also prayed, who also believed heaven was listening. The sound of the siege engines thundered again. Stones shattered walls, arrows fell like rain, and the knight felt his heart crack with them. He tightened his grip on the sword, not to fight, but to keep from shaking. "If this is God's will," he whispered, "then why does it look like hell?" No one answered. Only the wind replied, carrying the smell of smoke and burning oil. That night he dreamed of a river of blood flowing through a church, candles floating on its surface like lost souls. A woman stood in the current, her hands lifted to the sky, praying as the water reached her chest. He could not see her face, but he knew her voice. When he awoke, the city was still burning, and the hymn from his dream was still in his ears. He rose before dawn, placed his hand on his sword, and prayed again, not to win, but to be forgiven. In the lower quarter of Jerusalem, where the fire had not yet reached, a Saracen physician knelt beside the wounded. His robes were stained with soot, his hand steady as he bound the leg of a dying crusader. The man begged for water in broken Arabic. The physician gave it without a word. He had lost his own son 2 days before, a boy caught by a stray arrow. Yet his prayer that night was not for vengeance. It was for mercy, mercy for the living, mercy for the lost, mercy for both sides of the wall. Above him the convent bell groaned. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Inside the chapel, the nun moved among the fallen, her habit torn, her crucifix clutched close. She had refused to flee when the soldiers came. To her, Jerusalem was not a place to be conquered, but a heart to be kept alive. She whispered psalms over the dying, both Christian and Muslim, her Latin weaving softly with the physician's Arabic. Their words met in the air like two wings of the same prayer. The Templar found her there, kneeling beside the physician. For a moment he thought her a vision, light amid ruin, faith unbroken. He had come searching for survivors, for relics, perhaps for some proof that holiness had not entirely fled the city. But what he found was a woman praying over the man his brothers had called infidel. The sight pierced him deeper than any sword. The physician looked up, eyes calm despite the fire. He said something the knight could not understand. The nun translated in a trembling whisper. He says, "A prayer for you, brother, for peace, if not in heaven, then here." The knight froze. His lips parted, but no words came. He had not been called brother by anyone since he left home. Not by his order, not by his God. He watched as the nun pressed a damp cloth to the wounded crusader's face. "He was killing your people," the knight said, his voice low, uncertain. The nun looked at him. "And now he is dying in mine," she answered. What difference remains between us when breath leaves? Outside, shouts echoed, crusaders breaking through the city gates, the sound of triumph mixed with slaughter. The physician closed his eyes, murmured verses from the Quran. The knight recognized fragments. God is merciful. He had heard the same words in Latin his entire life, yet now they sounded different, truer perhaps, spoken by one who had lost everything. He lowered his sword, almost ashamed to hold it. The nun touched his arm lightly as if to steady him. "If you are to save something tonight," she said, "let it be your soul." The knight turned toward the door but could not move. The room flickered with firelight. The crucifix above the altar cast a shadow across the physician's bowed head. The image was unbearable, a Christian cross falling upon a Muslim who prayed beneath it, two faiths sharing the same silence. A sudden crash shook the walls. The nun flinched. The knight stepped forward, instinctively shielding her. He could feel her trembling through the sleeve of his armor. Her lips moved again, the same quiet hymn he had heard in his dream. The physician whispered once more before he rose. "Tell your men to stop. Tell them we have families. Tell them we bleed the same." The knight nodded, though he knew no one would listen. He wanted to say something, to the physician, to the nun, to God, but no words came. The three of them stood in the smoke, each praying in a different tongue to the same silent sky. Outside, the bells of Jerusalem began to fall, one by one. And in that moment, the knight saw it clearly. Faith did not belong to banners or creeds. It lived here, fragile and burning, between a nun's whisper and an enemy's prayer. The night fell heavy over Jerusalem, thick with the smoke of the day's sins. The fires had devoured the markets, the homes, the mosques, the churches, until every stone seemed to bleed. The knight walked through it as if through a dream, his armor scorched, his face blackened with ash. His brothers sang hymns of victory outside the Holy Sepulchre, their voices rough with triumph. "Jerusalem is free," they cried. "God has delivered his city." But to the knight, it did not sound like deliverance. It sounded like mourning. He passed the bodies in the alleys, soldiers and civilians tangled together, indistinguishable in death. He stepped over a fallen standard still smoldering, the red cross of his order, and felt no pride. The air was thick with incense and rot. Somewhere in the distance, a priest chanted Te Deum. The melody wavered, lost in the crackle of fire. The knight stopped beside a shattered fountain. The water within was crimson. He leaned on his sword and looked at his reflection, eyes hollow, mouth cracked, face of a stranger. "Is this your will?" he asked the knight. "Is this what you wanted?" The question vanished into the wind. Heaven gave no answer. He remembered the nun's words. "If I die, tell him I wasn't afraid." He wished he had her courage. He wished he had her faith. He wished heaven would speak to him the way it seemed to speak to her. But there was only silence. Vast, endless, merciless silence. He walked toward the convent again. The gate hung open, burned black. The courtyard was littered with ash and fragments of glass. Inside, the chapel glowed faintly with embers. The altar was gone, the crucifix half melted. Yet in the center of the ruin knelt the nun, still alive, her back straight, her hands clasped. The fire had touched everything but her faith. He stopped a few steps away, afraid to disturb her. She was whispering something, not words of fear, but prayer. The sound was faint, steady, unwavering. It was not a plea for rescue. It was a conversation with absence. The kind of prayer said when one already knows there will be no answer. The knight fell to his knees. His sword clattered beside him. "Heaven is silent," he said. The nun opened her eyes slowly. "Then listen harder," she replied. He bowed his head. "I have listened, and I hear nothing." She looked at him with tired eyes. "Silence is not nothing. It is what remains when all the shouting is done. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to feel God in the stillness, but all he felt was guilt pressing on his chest. He could still hear the cries outside, the laughter of drunk soldiers, the groans of the dying. And yet, here inside these walls, the world seemed paused, time holding its breath. A single ember floated between them, spiraling in the air before settling on the stone floor. The nun watched it fade. "The fire will pass," she said softly, "but the soul must answer for what it has seen." The knight's throat tightened. "Then my soul is lost." She shook her head. "No, only waiting to be found." He looked up. Her face was calm, lit by the trembling glow of dying light. It was not beauty that struck him, but peace, a peace that made him ache. For the first time, he wanted not to fight, but to understand. Outside, the bells of the sepulchre began to ring. The sound rolled over the city like thunder, calling the victors to prayer. The knight and the nun did not move. They remained kneeling, their shadows stretching long across the stone. Two figures before a broken altar, waiting for a God who would not speak. And yet in that silence something shifted, not in heaven, but in him. He realized that faith was not the voice that answered. It was the courage to wait in the quiet when the voice did not come. The dawn came slow, pale and trembling, its light breaking through smoke like a confession. The city still smoldered. Black banners flapped over walls crusted with ash. From the north quarter came the sound of men shouting, looting, laughing. Jerusalem, the holy dream of Christendom, had become a feverish ruin. The knight stood in the convent doorway, the hilt of his sword slick in his hand. He had not slept. He had not prayed. The silence of heaven had followed him into morning. Behind him, the nun moved quietly among the wounded. She tore strips from her robe to bind their arms, poured water into their cracked mouths, and sang under her breath, a low, steady hymn that made the air seem less cruel. The knight watched her, unsure if what he felt was reverence or shame. Every note she sang sounded like the mercy he had lost. A crash came from outside. A group of crusaders pushed into the courtyard, their armor gleaming with soot and blood. They were laughing, wild with victory. One of them carried a torch. "We were told Saracens hide here," said the tallest. His voice slurred with exhaustion and wine. "We'll cleanse it for God." The nun stood, still holding her crucifix. The knight stepped forward. "No one here fights you," he said. The soldiers looked at him and sneered. "A Templar protecting heathens?" one spat. "What did you find in here, brother? Temptation?" The knight's hand went to his sword. The tallest man swung his torch toward the chapel. Fire licked the broken door. The nun gasped, stepping between them, her face streaked with soot, but her gaze unflinching. "This is the house of God," she said quietly. "Even now." The soldier raised his torch higher. The knight drew his blade. For an instant the world held its breath, the silence before sin. The nun looked at him, eyes calm, lips trembling only from smoke. "If I die," she whispered again, "tell him I wasn't afraid." The knight froze. The memory of her first words cut through him like a second blade. He could see the reflection of fire on her crucifix, the trembling of her hands, the faith that refused to die, even as everything holy turned to cinders. He realized then that the battle was not for the city. It was for his soul. The torch fell. The flames caught the tapestries, the wooden beams. Smoke rose like incense. The crusaders laughed as they turned to leave, but the knight did not move. He turned his sword downward and let it fall. The clang on the stone floor echoed like a church bell at a funeral. The sound silenced the room. Even the fire seemed to pause. He took a step forward, unarmed. "Enough," he said, his voice trembling but sure. "This is not victory. This is sin." The soldiers stopped. Their faces flickered with confusion. The nun's eyes widened. For a heartbeat, it seemed the world itself hesitated. Flames, wind, men. Then one soldier spat and left, muttering. Another followed. Soon the courtyard emptied, leaving only the night, the nun, and the smoke curling toward the sky. He turned to her. "Go," he said. "There's still time." But she shook her head. "You dropped your sword," she said. "Now the city is holy again." He wanted to answer, to tell her she was wrong, that holiness could not live in such ruin. But as she stepped past him, leading the wounded toward the light, he saw it. Something pure in the air, fragile but real. The flames roared behind them, devouring the chapel, the relics, the banners. The knight lifted one of the injured men onto his shoulder and followed her into the courtyard. Together they moved through the smoke, each step heavier, slower. The bell tower cracked above them, stones falling like judgment. The nun looked back once. The knight saw the reflection of fire in her eyes and thought of sunrise. They reached the street as the roof collapsed. A gust of heat swept over them, carrying the smell of burning incense. The nun pressed the crucifix into his hand. "Keep this," she said. "If heaven is silent, it will still remember." Then she turned away, vanishing into the haze of light. The knight looked at the crucifix, half burned, half shining, and knelt. He did not pray for victory. He prayed for mercy. And for the first time since the war began, he felt it. The war was over, but peace never came. Jerusalem belonged to the cross now, yet the streets smelled of rot and memory. The knight wandered them alone. His white mantle turned to gray, the mark of the Templars still visible beneath layers of ash. He had no command, no brothers, no home. His act of mercy had condemned him in the eyes of men. To them he was a coward, a heretic in armor. To himself, he was simply awake. They had taken the holy city, but heaven had gone silent. No miracle followed. No light descended from the clouds. Only the crows came, circling above the battlements like black prayers. The victors built altars from the ruins, washed their swords in the Jordan, and sang of glory. The knight watched them, his face empty. He had fought for years to see this place, yet now it felt smaller than the faith he had lost. One evening he walked to the Mount of Olives, where Christ once wept over the city. The view below was smoke and dust. He knelt among the burned olive trees and opened his hand. The crucifix the nun had given him lay there, its edges charred, the figure of Christ half melted. He traced the metal with his thumb and whispered, "I did not protect you." The wind carried no reply. He wondered if God had turned away, or if God had never been what they thought. He remembered her voice, steady amid the flames. "Tell him I wasn't afraid." He wondered where she had gone. Perhaps she had perished in the chaos, or fled to the desert, or been taken in by those she had once tended. It did not matter. Her faith had survived in him, and it burned quieter but truer than before. He tried to pray again, but the words came out wrong. Not "forgive me," but "remember me." It felt like confession without absolution. Each night he slept among the ruins, hearing the echoes of victory songs fading into guilt. Sometimes he dreamed of the other knights, those who mocked him, those who died believing they were pure. In the dream they stood on a vast plain, shouting toward a dark sky that did not answer. He woke each time with tears and the taste of ash on his tongue. Weeks passed. The city began to rebuild. Markets reopened, churches were consecrated, processions wound through the streets where blood had once run ankle-deep. But the knight could not join them. He had become a shadow, wandering the edges of holiness. When people passed him, they turned their eyes away. Some whispered that he had gone mad, that he had seen angels. Others said he had seen too much of men. One night he entered the new church the Crusaders had raised over the ruins of the sepulchre. Candles flickered along the nave. Pilgrims knelt, weeping. A priest recited prayers for the fallen, his voice thin as thread. The knight stood at the back, watching. When the service ended, he approached the altar and laid the crucifix there, blackened and bent. The priest saw him and frowned. "What is this?" he asked. The knight answered, "What remains of faith?" The priest shook his head, confused, but the knight had already turned away. He stepped out into the night, the stars veiled by smoke. Somewhere distant bells rang, the same sound that had once called men to war. Now it felt like penance. He walked beyond the city gates, through the quiet hills where no banners flew. Alone beneath the endless sky, he whispered, "I dropped the sword." The words felt both wound and healing. The wind moved through the olive branches, whispering like the breath of forgiveness. He closed his eyes, and for the first time he did not see fire. He saw light. What it cost him was everything: a name, a brotherhood, a place in history. But what he gained could not be written. It was silence. It was mercy. And in that silence, heaven finally spoke. Years passed like fading incense. The Crusaders ruled Jerusalem, but their glory dulled with each season. The banners on the citadel frayed, the gold on the altars peeled, and the songs of victory turned to mutters of doubt. Pilgrims came and went, whispering of miracles that never arrived. The city stood, but its holiness had grown thin, as if the heavens themselves had grown weary of watching men claim God with bloodied hands. The knight lived in the shadows of that city. He no longer wore his mantle. The cross upon his chest had been scraped away, leaving only the ghost of its shape. By day, he helped rebuild what war had broken: roof beams, wells, gardens. By night, he sat alone near the ruins of the convent, where weeds now grew through the stones. He carried the burned crucifix still, wrapped in a strip of linen. It was the only thing the fire had not consumed completely. The face of Christ was half melted, the body charred, but one arm still stretched outward, untouched, as if mercy itself refused to die. Sometimes he would hold it to the light and imagine he saw her again, the nun who had given it to him. In the glow of the dying sun, he could almost hear her voice. "If I die, tell him I wasn't afraid." Her courage haunted him more gently than his guilt. It reminded him that faith could survive even the ruin of its temples. He began visiting a small chapel beyond the city walls where the stones were cracked and the candles few. No one came there anymore. He brought the crucifix with him, setting it before the altar each time he prayed. His prayers were different now, quiet, without requests. He no longer asked God for answers. He simply sat in the stillness, waiting, listening. One evening, as a sandstorm swept in from the desert, the knight knelt there again. The roof leaked, and the wind moaned through the broken windows like an organ's lament. He unwrapped the crucifix and set it on the altar. The candlelight flickered across its burned surface, turning the blackened metal to gold. For a moment, the face of Christ seemed alive again, not in pain, but in peace. The knight bowed his head. He spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear. "I was your soldier. I failed you. But perhaps that was your mercy, that I should fail." His voice trembled. "If the sword was never meant to save, then let this relic bear witness instead. Let it remember what we forgot." He lifted the crucifix once more, kissed it, and found the courage to let it go. He placed it within a hollow in the chapel wall, behind a loose stone, and sealed it with his bare hands. Dust clung to his fingers. He whispered a final prayer, not of triumph, not even of forgiveness, but of remembrance. Outside, the wind died. The city lights shimmered faintly through the haze. Somewhere beyond the walls, bells tolled for vespers. The knight rose, looked once more at the wall where he had hidden the relic, and smiled, a thin, tired smile that carried both sorrow and release. He left the chapel without his sword, without his cross, without his name. Centuries would pass. Empires would rise and fall. Pilgrims would rebuild the chapel, never knowing what lay sealed in its heart. And when sunlight finally broke through its cracked window again, it would fall upon that burned crucifix, half ash, half gold, a silent witness to the day a soldier chose mercy over victory. Faith would live there still, in the dust, in the quiet, in the waiting. The night would be forgotten, but the symbol would remain. Because even in ruin, something holy endures. They took Jerusalem. They took the walls, the gates, the altars, the tomb. But not heaven. Heaven, that silent kingdom, remained untouched. For those who had seen the city burn, the light of victory faded quickly. Triumph turned to penance, and the songs of glory were swallowed by the wind. The knight's name disappeared from the rolls of his order. His deeds were not written, his mercy not recorded. History does not reward those who drop the sword. But heaven remembers differently. Years later, pilgrims spoke of a rumor, the story of a Templar who spared a nun in the fire. Some said he went mad. Others said he vanished into the desert, walking barefoot toward the sunrise. The tale changed with each retelling. But one thing never did: the moment he chose silence over blood. For every crusader who believed victory proved God's favor, there was one who doubted, one who trembled, one who saw the reflection of the divine in the eyes of the enemy. The knight was one of those few. He carried the weight of his mercy as others carried swords. And though he was condemned by men, perhaps he was forgiven by the only witness who mattered. The chroniclers wrote of gold, of conquest, of relics seized. They called it deliverance. But the true relic of that war was not made of stone or silver. It was a crucifix burned by mercy, hidden in the wall of a forgotten chapel, a quiet protest against the noise of history. The nun's words survived too, though no parchment bore them. "If I die, tell him I wasn't afraid." They passed from tongue to tongue like a secret prayer, carried by wind, by time, by those who still believed faith could be gentle. The knight once asked himself if God could still dwell in a city turned to ash. The answer, whispered by centuries, was yes, because one act of compassion had made it holy again. He had come to Jerusalem seeking redemption. He left having learned that redemption is never won by victory. It is found in surrender. When the bells of the sepulchre ring now, their echoes carry more than the memory of conquest. They carry the tremor of conscience, the reminder that faith cannot be forced, only lived. The city still shines at dawn, its domes catching fire with light. And somewhere beneath its stones, in that sealed wall, the burned crucifix waits. Perhaps heaven never closed its gates. Perhaps it waited, patient, for one man to understand that the way to God is not through the sword, but through mercy. They took Jerusalem, but they never kept heaven. Jerusalem breathes again, centuries later. The scars of the siege are buried beneath marble and prayer, but the air still remembers. The pilgrims still come, tracing the same stones that once burned beneath the knight's feet. They whisper the same names, speak the same psalms, and lift their eyes toward the same silent sky. The city forgives no one, yet it receives everyone. Inside a chapel near the Lion's Gate, candlelight trembles against the walls. Tourists pass without noticing the faint crack in one corner of the altar, just another fracture in old stone. But behind that stone, sealed away in dust, lies the burned crucifix. It has waited 1,000 years in the dark, half ash, half gold, untouched by war or time. It does not speak, yet it tells a story louder than sermons. Some nights, when the wind shifts from the desert, the candles flicker, as if stirred by something unseen. The caretakers say it is the breath of pilgrims, Others say it is memory itself, the sigh of mercy still haunting the city. The knight's name has long vanished from record. The nun's grave was never found, but the act remains. Like an ember under the centuries, when a soldier lowers his weapon, when a stranger spares another, when forgiveness is chosen over fury. Jerusalem lives again. History remembers the kings, the banners, the blood. Heaven remembers the quiet ones, the man who dropped the sword, the woman who would not flee, the prayer that rose through smoke. If you walk those streets today, you can still hear them. Not in the cries of conquest, but in the hush between bells. The silence that falls when faith, for a heartbeat, becomes mercy. Because mercy survived the Crusades. It survived the fire, the betrayal, the noise. It hid in a burned crucifix, and in the trembling hands of those who still believe kindness can outlast empires. When you see a church at dusk, when the last light turns its stones to gold, remember this. Holiness is not in what was won, but in what was spared. If history still bleeds, it bleeds for mercy. And if mercy survived the Crusades, it can survive us.